It is such a pleasure, personal pleasure for me, but also an honor for our store to have Sean Wilentz here at Politics and Prose this evening. For those of you who don't already know this, he's a prize-winning author and professor of history at Princeton, a frequent commentator on the op-ed pages of our most respected journalistic publications, and a keen observer of how historical forces and patterns shape the politics and politicians of today. And he's also clearly a master of extremely good timing. Tonight he'll be talking about his new book. It's called The Politicians and the Egalitarians, The Hidden History of American Politics. This is a truly thoughtful addition to the growing canon of books about the 2016 presidential campaign. And this is not about the presidential campaign, but it is in many sort of other ways, not directly. But it certainly will inform our already heated public discourse this year. And needless to say, and I'm sure some in this room agree, that anything that contributes to a rational discussion of politics this year is welcome indeed. Now, okay, I just had to check this out. So right at this moment, it's like 7:05, we are exactly 165 days, 5 hours, and 55 minutes away from the presidential election. So we're very much hoping that in just 1 hour, in the next hour, Professor Wilentz can offer some insights into the dynamics of the current campaign and who, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, apologies to the Bernie people, but it ain't happening, is likely to be in the Oval Office next January. Now, he began working on this book more than 8 years ago, but remarkably, the focus of it turns out to be some of the central themes of this year's campaign, particularly partisanship and income inequality, the role of political parties, the roles of politicians inside the system and agitators outside the system, the merits of politicians who actually are skilled in the art of politics. And Sean also deals with another current of the campaign. How do we achieve egalitarianism, and what role do egalitarians play in driving politics or not? So all of this makes for extremely fascinating and indeed, I would say, essential reading for anyone who's interested in understanding the roots of the political trends we're witnessing and, in fact, experiencing in this unprecedented election year. And let me just say that he is already hard at work on another book. That one is going to be on slavery, anti-slavery, and the Constitution. So it is really unfair to say what I'm about to say to a man who is right at this moment on a book tour and already working on another book. But clearly, you're going to have to write an epilogue right about the second week of November, I think. So an epilogue to The Politicians and the Egalitarians will be a work in progress beginning, right, the second week of November. Actually, now that I think of it, it may have to be an entire second volume. So with that, please join me in a warm welcome to Professor Sean Wilentz.
Wow, thank you for that lovely introduction. And a new assignment, great. No, Alyssa and I go back a long way. It's, as the son of a bookstore owner from New York from a while back, it's always a pleasure to be in an independent bookstore. They are the heart and soul of our literary life, and it's just a pleasure to be here. So I thank you very, very much. Now, okay, so I'm going to explain who's going to win the election, why we're going to, no, I'm not going to do any of that. I actually started this book 25 years ago. The oldest chapter really began life 25 years ago. And sometimes you do write a book without realizing you're writing a book. This is the first time it's ever happened to me. In 2001, I wrote an essay called The Lost American Egalitarian Tradition. And it was trying to make the point that there was an argument about economic inequality and how disparities of wealth were bad for democracy. They went back to the beginning of the Republic, and I tried to trace its history more or less to the present. In 2001, nobody cared about that. No one read that, as far as I know, other than the editor and myself. It was not a big topic. It was after 9/11, da-da. Some years later, I wrote a piece about partisanship in American politics, just at the point when the president was starting to get much more partisan, so that nobody cared about that anymore either. But I did realize that if you put those two pieces, these two forgotten pieces, together, there was actually an argument to be made about the character of American political history. Well, 2 chapters don't make a book. But then I realized that everything I'd been writing for the last 25 years has something to say to those issues, to that question. Not everything I'd been written. The last time I was here, I was talking about Bob Dylan. He does not particularly. I mean, I can stretch him in if I want, but no. But much of what I've been writing about for the last 25 years actually had to do with these issues. So I went back and I went over a lot of them. I rewrote some of them ferociously to try and bring them together, and the result is this book, which I'm very happy to be talking about tonight. So that's how it happened. That's the background. The key to this book is the ampersand on the front. Very often these days we think of the politicians and the egalitarians as 2 different tribes. And in some ways they are very different. But nothing gets done without the ampersand. It is the convergence of egalitarian politics and what we want to call it mainstream politics that gets things done in American history. Very often, much of the time, those 2 forces are disjointed, not together. But when they combine, extraordinary things can happen. And that's kind of the nutshell of the book. But it also is a bit of moral philosophy. And I know moral philosophy and politics often don't go together. They're not assumed to go together. But there is a point to be made, and it comes actually in the epigraph to the book, the beginning of the book, which comes from the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, an early essay of his published in 1929. And I quote, "It may be well for the statesman to know that statesmanship easily degenerates into opportunism, and that opportunism cannot be sharply distinguished from dishonesty." We all know that. But the prophet ought to realize that his higher perspective and the uncompromising nature of his judgments always has a note of irresponsibility in it. Francis of Assisi may have been a better Christian than Pope Innocent III, but it may be questioned whether his moral superiority over the latter was as absolute as it seemed. Nor is there any reason to believe that Abraham Lincoln, the statesman and opportunist, was morally inferior to William Lloyd Garrison, the prophet. The moral achievement of the statesman must be judged in terms which take account of the limitations of human society, which the statesman must, and the prophet need not, consider. I should have just stopped there, actually. That's sort of my point. He said it much better. But I will read a bit from the introduction, which lays out the basic argument in more detail than I just have, and give a little bit, I don't know, about half an hour, a little bit from the 2 main essays, and then if we have time, I'll read from one of the others as well. I'll let you choose who you want to hear about, okay? Everybody from Thomas Paine to LBJ. Lots of people in there. But here's the beginning. I need some water. Okay. There are 2 keys to unlocking the secrets of American politics and American political history. Current historians, in their enthusiasm for insight of a new and attractive sort, have mislaid these keys, and now they are hidden from sight. Once recovered, though, and put to use, the keys quickly demonstrate their usefulness. The first key is to recognize both the permanent reality and the effectiveness of partisanship and party politics. Americans have been loath to believe these things. The founding generation distrusted parties. The framers of the Constitution designed a national government they hoped would avoid partisanship's debased ambitions and destructive tendencies. More than 100 years later, reformers of the progressive era similarly distrusted parties and tried to replace them with nonpartisan elections and independent commissions of experts. Americans in our own time think likewise. We deplore partisanship. We want government conducted in a lofty manner, without adversarial confrontation and chaos. But more than 200 years of anti-partisanship has produced nothing. This is because, despite their intentions, the framers built a political system which inspired partisan politics. After some badly needed constitutional tinkering, the system soon fostered the rise of professional, mass-based national parties. A nation as large and diverse as the United States has required parties both to turn discontent into laws and institutions and to prevent chronic political breakdown. Americans devised election rules that hand victory to the winner of a plurality of votes, which, according to the axioms of political science, virtually assures a two-party system in which third parties do not last. Possibly partisan politics is built into human nature. It is certainly built into the American version of human nature. And partisan politics has survived because in the United States it's worked well, or well enough. Historians nowadays dismiss this basic truth. They regard the political parties as hindrances to democracy and glorify political outsiders and social movements. They point with justice to the countless and unending episodes of partisan politicians corrupting our politics and sustaining social wrongs. Yet the great issues in our history have been settled not from friction between politicians and egalitarians, but from the convergence of protest and politics. Party democracy succeeded even in addressing the most oppressive of all American problems, which was slavery, and which in the end could only be settled in blood. Impeded by a party system designed to keep slavery out of national politics, anti-slavery partisans and politicians built parties of their own, and the carefully rigged party system fell apart. And the election to the presidency of one of the anti-slavery party politicians, Abraham Lincoln, forced the crisis that led to the slaveholders' rebellion and, in time, emancipation. Ever since, all the great American social legislation, from the Progressive era to the New Deal to the Great Society, has been achieved by and through the political parties. The second key to American political history is the recognition that from the very start, Americans have recognized and sometimes been consumed by the need to combat economic privilege and to strengthen what Walt Whitman called, quote, the true gravitation hold, a vast intertwining reticulation of wealth. The struggle against economic inequality has been a great subterranean river in our political past, sometimes breaking through the surface, sometimes returning underground. Americans have fought endlessly about the meaning of democracy and about government authority and about rights and social justice. Running through these fights has been a recurring insistence that vast material inequalities directly threaten democracy. This, too, we've been reluctant to see. The founding generation did not proclaim economic equality, as the founders believed that sound political institutions would sustain a just and harmonious society. We don't read about this kind of egalitarianism in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights. We do read about it, though, in numerous pamphlets and speeches, as well as in the correspondence of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and conflicts over economic privilege dominated American national politics, from the battles between Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton to the furious clashes of the era of Andrew Jackson. Slavery first stunted and then deformed American democracy, and its racist legacy has complicated, distorted, and sometimes disrupted the politics of economic inequality. Not only does white racism sustain and deepen great disparities of wealth, it has stamped American history so strongly that economic inequality has become symptomatic of racial injustice. To talk about one has often meant talking about the other. Thus, when anti-slavery forces attacked human bondage as immoral, they also attacked it as the cornerstone of hateful economic and political privilege as exercised by the aristocratic slave power and its northern accomplices. The war to crush the slaveholders' rebellion became a war of emancipation, but it was also from the start a fight to vindicate American democracy against the domineering and finally secessionist slaveocracy, its wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite. After the egalitarian impulses of the Civil War years dissipated, an ideology of rugged individualism, white supremacy, and the blessings of big business subdued all talk of inequality. Efforts by blacks and their supporters to lay full claim to the egalitarian tradition were crushed after the overthrow of Reconstruction, and trade unionists and a new class of industrial workers suffered harsh repression. The so-called progressive movement, and even more the New Deal, brought the issue of economic inequality back front and center, as in time did Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, which transcended the New Deal by joining the fight for economic equality to the one for racial justice. But by the late 1960s, the egalitarian politics unleashed by the Great Depression and then recast by the Civil Rights Movement began losing steam and began losing its way. The long conservative era, heralded by the election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980, seemed a repudiation of Great Society egalitarianism. Conservatives advanced regressive economic and fiscal policies and launched a divisive and politically devastating culture war based on race and religion. Dissenting egalitarian politics became framed by claims of racial identities and sexual affinities. Pundits wondered why so many ordinary Americans seemed so willing to vote against their economic interests. Historians tried to explain the shortcomings and continual failures of economic egalitarianism in American politics. Yet the issue of economic equality has been the great perennial question in American political history. This has come back into focus since the great crash of 2008, compelling Republicans as well as Democrats to decry the massive and growing divergences between the wealthiest Americans and the rest of the country. How long the refocusing will last is hard to tell. I wrote this a year ago, so it's hard to tell. But it does prompt us to look where we have not wanted to look when considering past politics in the United States and to see things that we have failed to see. So, he says, with these two keys, the primacy of party politics and the eternal underlying question of economic privilege and inequality, the whole of American political history begins to emerge more clearly. In the beginning, democracy in America rested on the proposition that vast inequalities of wealth were threatening and intolerable. Securing that proposition since has required fitting it into party politics, which has not always been easy to do. Political leaders, otherwise hostile to economic privilege, have been crippled by their connections to slavery and Jim Crow segregation. At times, neither national party has been alert to widening gaps of wealth and power, or to the policies and institutions which abetted those gaps. Relations between party politics and protest politics have sometimes been fraught, and in the absence of capable leadership, they have become destructive. Still, the driving force in American political history has been the effort to curb the power of concentrated wealth, whether the power of the slaveholders or the power of industrial plutocrats. Often, egalitarians berate politicians as slow-moving wafflers, and politicians despair of egalitarians' obliviousness to the burdens of democratic government. But just as it is crucial in a democracy for egalitarians to agitate, so it is vital that politicians do all they can to advance equality within the limits of public opinion and the Constitution, sometimes to the point of amending the Constitution, as with the final destruction of slavery. American political history can be understood as the fitful history of the politicians and the egalitarians and the fateful occasions when their labors converge. That's the argument. There it all is. Now, how much more time have I got? 5-10 minutes. Before questions. What do you want to do? I could give you a little taste of. Okay, I'll explain what happens in the book. Thereafter, you get past that part. You've got two chapters. One on the post-partisanship or anti-partisanship in American politics and why it's never worked, and why party politics are essential to getting anything done, and why we need political parties. The second is on the egalitarian tradition in American history. Those are the first two. They basically amplify or expand on what I just said. We then have chapters, we have 12 more chapters talking about various events, persons, etc., that illustrate that theme. Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, John Quincy Adams, John Brown and the Temptation of Terror. Abraham Lincoln, he gets 2 chapters. The the Homestead Strike, W.E.B. Du Bois, which is maybe my favorite chapter in the book. Theodore Roosevelt, a chapter on the 1930s, a chapter on the Cold War, and finally Lyndon Johnson. Each one of those persons, events, and so forth illustrate what I mean to say, and I think establish the history whereby party politics and egalitarianism have converged and have diverged over time, and why they have converged and diverged. So, in the little bit of time, would you like to hear a little bit from one of those? And no? What would you like to hear?
I'd like to hear you.
You want to hear me? Yeah, but I write so much better than I talk. I mean, I talk okay, but, well, all right. I mean, the one that that was the most heartfelt in some ways, the one that touched me the most was writing about Du Bois. Because I wrote a great deal about economic inequality, but the questions of racial inequality and slavery and so forth, as you can see, are built into the argument. I mean, they're not on the side. They are part of what I'm talking about. And Du Bois had a heroic education, and that's the subtitle. That's the title of the chapter. Du Bois, in The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903, wrote something absolutely extraordinary about the quality of American life in general, and especially the quality of African American life in the United States. What it was like to grow up being on the one hand, an American, but then being rejected as an American. What was it to be an American and a Negro, as he put it? Two souls in one body. How can that possibly, how can you possibly make sense of that? How can you finally find a way to converge the two? And in terms of politics, it set up a question of try to define what race is in American life. And I make the point, actually, that some of Du Bois' thinking about race was kind of muddled at this point. It was mixed up in all kinds of Victorian mystical stuff. This was, 1903. It's not what we think of today, right? We don't have a genome project. We don't know about Then it was kind of mystical. And it talks about how he came to terms with race over time and tried to figure it out. But I'll close with this, because I think it's my favorite passage in the book, okay? It's about the book itself, and it's about how you can understand something about that book given the author who wrote it. And I will get to that. It's going to take me, I'll get it down to 3 minutes. Finally, the strangeness and the audacity of The Souls of Black Folk arose less from broad historical circumstances than from the strangeness and audacity of its author. Du Bois pitched his arguments to the intended talented tenth, the quality folk who prided themselves on being representative Negroes. As his ideas took shape, however, the young Du Bois may have been, and may have felt himself to be, the most marginal man in America. The future prophet of the color line had been born, after all, a mulatto, as he put it, in blood about 1/2 or more Negro and the rest French and Dutch, he claimed in one letter. Born and raised in Massachusetts, the northern state widely considered the cradle of abolitionism, but a state, he learned early in life, that was hardly free of racial prejudice. At Harvard, only the 7th man of African descent admitted, he won abundant praise from his teachers, but he felt distanced from his fellow students by his humble class background as well as by his color. He would later write that he was at but not of the place. He later studied in Berlin. In Berlin, where, his biographer observes, Du Bois spent some of his most exuberant and carefree days, he soaked up all he could in the classroom, awestruck, proud, determined to make the most of his miraculous, if fully merited, opportunity. Yet in Germany, the division in Du Bois' soul deepened as he heard his teacher, Heinrich von Treitschke, one of the intellectual founders of Prussian Aryan nationalism, the greatest of all the professors in Du Bois' estimation, explode from the lecture podium. And I won't inflict my German on you, I'll give you the translation. The mulattoes are inferior. They feel themselves inferior. Du Bois' Berlin notebook is filled with the generic self-conscious angst of a precocious graduate student abroad, but with special twists and turns. Descriptions of solitary midnight ceremonies by candlelight, with prayer to the zeitgeist about fulfilling his destiny. Sit-along descriptions of mornings giving over to contemplation, and singing to himself, in his German boarding house, America the Beautiful, and Steal Away to Jesus. And then, after his return, and as he completed his doctorate at Harvard, America's foremost young black scholar found himself confined in his first teaching post to the lower reaches of the Black Academy at what was then the third-rate Wilberforce College in Ohio, knowing he would never teach in any white college or university. Du Bois, in short, suffered a singular fate. Raised by his heroic education to scholarly levels unreached by all but a handful of American whites, he still lived in a civilization where his color marked him as a non-person, one who, when he traveled, rode the Jim Crow car. A man of reason, he would not forsake his reason's achievements, but the world of reason turned out to be utterly unreasonable, casting him, of all people, as a pariah. Here, with all of its idiosyncrasies, was the matrix of double consciousness, and it was as untypical as an experience as could be imagined. But, brilliant and arrogant as he was, and with the prestige he could command among his fellow blacks and sympathetic whites, Du Bois was able, in the souls of black folk, to translate his personal dilemma into a universal drama of race and render it convincing. He did not stop there, and he lived a long time after 1903 and did a great deal, including helped to found the NAACP. Yet his works endure, above all, though, souls of black folk. And in its endurance, however, lies some of its greatest ironies. If in its own time souls was a peculiar thing, Jim Crow's subsequent demise has made its themes of doubleness and identity far more prominent, not just for black intellectuals, but for a newly expanded black middle class on whom the competing claims of particularism and acceptance in an America where racism powerfully abides bears down all the harder. Du Bois's double consciousness may prove inadequate to these pressures, simplistic in its dualism, reducing universal ambivalences and anxieties to purely racial terms. But if Souls of Black Folk imparts a heady, uplifting love of blackness and the soul of the sorrow songs, and with that, in its more dubious passages, a fabricated racial mysticism, it also describes an act of refusal. A refusal to allow alienation to become a surrender to self-reference or to any cramped conception of race. Quote, this is Du Bois, "I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aurelius and Aristotle and what soul I will, and they come graciously with no scorn or condescension." In his reclamation of the spirituality of the oppressed and the despised, Du Bois also wrote a paean to what is nowadays sometimes glibly stigmatized as the culture of the oppressors. For all of their orotund phrasing, it took a beautiful defiance to write these words in 1903. They were an assertion of individuality and genius, as well as of race pride. And today, in a very different but still racialized America, their beauty has not dimmed. And that's W.B. Du Bois. Thank you. Thank you. You can see I kind of like that one. That one I kind of like. So,
If you have questions,
questions.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm going to count how long it takes before the name Donald Trump is uttered.
Well, you're not going to win that one with
Very
me.
good.
Although it's implied in my question.
Very good.
I mean, it's my impression, set up against, of course, your knowledge, that basically since the Reagan years, the Republicans at the federal level, both in Congress and their presidents, have basically taken no significant initiatives with respect to promoting greater equality in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So it's my impression that we've been in a long 30-year phase of divergence, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Although the Democrats at times have been fairly low-key on this issue also. So if there is a divergence, it's not exclusively a Republican-caused result, but it is, in my view, primarily. Is that an impression that you would share?
Yeah. Actually, I wrote a whole book about this too. So I'll plug my other book. I wrote a book called The Age of Reagan. which kind of sums it all up. Yeah, I mean, it really goes back to 1968 in some ways, but certainly since Reagan, we have been living in a very conservative age, which has been a reaction against all of the progressive reforms going back to the New Deal and including the reforms of the Civil Rights Movement. And that's what we've been living in for a very long time. That's been the predominant part of it. The problem for the Republicans was they went so far to the right and they so agitated a base and they built up a culture war that was going on that basically the guards lost control of the asylum. And that's the Republican Party, I think, that we're seeing today. The Democrats have been divided going back to 68, going all the way back to that. And it had to do with the war and it had to do with the way politics ought to be conducted. But I think the Clinton administration salvaged or refashioned the Democratic Party. But the fights were going to continue because the splits were never completely undone between the left and the right, or not the right, but the mainstream and the left of the Democratic Party. Everything changed in 2008. Everything changed for two reasons. One, Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. Weeks after the Great Crash. Those are the two things that happened. Obama's election basically announced that the Republican culture war was not going to win. The clock was not going to be set back. We have an African-American president. But the Great Crash meant that those issues of economic inequality, which have been submerged since the 1980s at least, were going to come back up. And that even Republicans, as well as Democrats, are going to be saying there's too much divergence of wealth, as you were hearing. And that gave a certain candidate a great deal, on the Republican side, a great deal of momentum. Because that candidate can sound very much like the left of the Democratic Party when he wants to. Blaming the problems on trade deals, it's sounding that way. I'm talking about Donald Trump. I'm going to be the one who mentions him. The Republican Party got itself into the place where someone like Trump could go in and just take the nomination because they'd lost it. So that's a very long explanation to a very good question. Sir.
Especially given some of the issues you raised tonight, I'm curious as to your take at Princeton regarding the Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah. Well, I think Woodrow Wilson was a great progressive president. Let me begin that way. And I've known that, having been a historian. I knew all of the other parts of his career. He came from the South. He gave in on the segregation and so forth. I knew that was all there. I can see both of those things. I can own contradiction and still understand what was going on. But that's my job. I can understand why people would not like that. What we saw at Princeton, I think, was an interesting educational, event. I think people learned more than they thought they were going to learn. I think it began as a denunciation and ended up with an education. And, I'm not going to say how great my employer is. That would sound silly. But it does speak to what can happen if it's done right. That is to say, education. Because that's what it became. Not everybody's happy with the outcome, one way or another. But I do think that in the end, Princeton's a much richer, smarter place than it was when we began. Because things that I take for granted as an historian, people didn't always take for granted and had to be instructed. And I'm hoping that we can, Hemingway once said that a measure of grace is holding two opposing ideas at the same time and not going crazy, or something like that. That's what being a historian is about a lot of the time. It's very hard to think of too many people in the American past, too many of our great heroes in the American past, or the traditional great heroes in the American past who don't have something about them that's unsavory, particularly from the South, and you're white. But does that mean we're going to, and I talk about this, I have a chapter in this book called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Thomas Jefferson. Because Jefferson has fallen in estimation, Wilson, forget. It's Jefferson, right? And the essay, and I commend it to your attention, the essay tries to take on some of the stuff that's been said about Jefferson and showing how unfair it is, how many of his critics get just the basic facts wrong, how on the most explosive issue of all, the Sally Hemings story, in fact, the best writer on that, a woman named Annette Gordon-Reed, who teaches at the Harvard Law School, shows that it's not quite what many people think it was. And that there's a great deal that Jefferson must be honored for still, I think, in terms of the history of American democracy and the egalitarianism I'm talking about. So, we live in a world of contradiction, but historians' job is not to, we have the job, yes, we give moral judgments. We should give moral judgments, but we shouldn't become moralistic in our judgments because that'll get us nowhere. Then we'll be stuck in a bog of condemnation all the time. And what's the point of that? Okay? Sir.
Thank you. Professor, I'm curious if we could turn the focus on something here, which is American foreign policy. I was listening to what you were saying, and the two keys that you're saying is egalitarianism as a sort of the ideal and sort of reality politics, fighting in the dirt,
Right.
real politics. But I'm left with the impression that you see these as the primary moving keys to understanding America, yet we can go back in any of the last, half dozen elections in which foreign policy played a very important role, if sometimes subsidiary. So my question is this: is foreign policy a separate subcategory? Is it under your two keys? And I think you could make that argument because, for example, Carter was the purist. He brought human rights.
Yeah.
Nixon and Kissinger were the exact opposite, realpolitik and all that. But I wonder, could you put it in your perspective what you're saying about your book? Does one drive the other, or?
Yeah, I know. I haven't thought about this a great deal, not being a particular expert on foreign policy, so I'm not. It's not at the utmost. But as you were talking, and I was thinking, of course they're related, and they must be related. I mean, when the progressive presidents that we're talking about, Teddy Roosevelt, well, he was something of an imperialist, but Woodrow Wilson had a very different view. Now, their but both were political leaders. Both were politicians. I don't think, except in times of warfare. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and everybody else, please correct me if I'm wrong. I can't think of too many times when social movements get agitated over foreign policy except in times of war. I mean, it'll be out there. It's not as if we're silent about foreign policy. We think about it. But the great movements that I think of, if I'm wrong, I mean, I don't think I am.
Well, let's go a minute, if I may, to Reagan that you wrote about and Carter. My impression is that a lot of the reaction to Carter was channeled into Reagan, somewhat like people are doing now with Trump, America First.
Yes.
It was a reaction to the perception that America's role in the world had gone downhill.
Yeah.
So,
but that's a different question than egalitarianism in politics, what I'm talking about. So maybe they are not always so closely related. The question of American power in the world. Also, look, I mean, for example, at the very beginning of American political history in the 1790s, foreign policy was implicated directly in what the politics were all about because of the French Revolution. So Jefferson took one view of the French Revolution, the Federalists took a different view of the French Revolution, and became implicated in all of that. And you had, democratic Republican societies, and they'd call each other citizens and stuff. And they'd try the tricolor, and it was all kind of, some play acting. But there was a way in which those foreign affairs spoke to the issues that were driving domestic policy as well. And that can happen as well. So there are times in American history when they are actually, moving quite closely together. That's a very bad answer to a very good question. So I'll have to think about it some more.
yeah, I think it's an interesting one.
It is one.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, the earlier discussion you had about the fracturing of the Republican Party in the current political situation makes me wonder about the history of just the process of party fracturing and the how important it has that been in the way politics have gone. Starting with don't need to write a whole new book here if it's not already part of this book.
Right. No, I mean the question of parties fall apart. Parties are not static. Parties are always in motion. Parties are always coalitions, so therefore they're going to be contests about parties. And sometimes parties crack up. And often, actually, I just did write about this recently in the New York Times about last Sunday, I think. You can find it there. In 1800, and often questions of nativism are right at the heart of all of that. In the 1790s, When the Jeffersonians were coming up, the Federalists tried to repress them with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Alexander Hamilton, an immigrant, said we should deport all the immigrants, or most of them. That split the Federalist Party, and the Jeffersonians came in, and the Federalists never really recovered. So the Federalist Party, which was the first party, I suppose, in American history, if you want to see it that way, collapsed. The Whig Party in the 1850s collapsed over the issue of slavery, but also nativism was involved. Because of the Irish and Catholic nativism, a lot of the ex-Whigs went into the nativist party, the so-called American Party. When you hear the cry, "Make America Great Again," it usually means that a party crack-up's about to happen. And the reason is that the crack-ups happen because there's a feeling that America has been stolen away. And you see that with the Federalists, you see that with the nativists in the 1850s. You sort of saw it in the 1920s with the old guard Republicans talking about nativism as well, and then the economic collapse undid that. Right. Always there's the idea that somehow America's eminence is being undone. And if it's not the immigrants, then it's some other force. And in the past, that's led to severe crack-ups. Not necessarily to the disintegration, not necessarily to total collapse. The Republican Party didn't collapse in the 1930s. But it did suffer a great deal. I'm not saying that's going to happen now. But it could.
Suggests there are always a lot of people in the middle in order for that
Well,
to happen.
when parties break, parties will fragment for all kinds of reasons. But when a party there was a version of this with the Democrats in after '68, right? The anti-war Democrats and the Johnson Democrats or Humphrey Democrats, what have you, and it took till the '80s and '90s for the Democrats to fully recover. They didn't fall apart. They remained in control of Congress. They remained very powerful, but as a national party, they were very weakened by those divisions. Those divisions can be very, very powerful. That's really all I'm saying. Yes, ma'am.
I haven't heard anything about corporate power and the importance of a big money to parties and politicians.
Yes. Well, that's a question that comes up, it's come up this year very, very heavily, hasn't it? Right? And so the question becomes whether money has, the way that the system has been changed, especially in the aftermath of Citizens United and decisions like that, whether parties can even participate in politics without, in some ways, having to set up some sort of connection to big money. And one thing I think the Sanders campaign has shown is that you can raise a lot of money without that. Who knew? But now we know. Now, does that mean necessarily that lots of big money is always going to? I like to see the corruption before I think that there's corruption. But the question of big money in politics is, without question. Let me back up. There's always been money in politics. Let's not kid ourselves, right? And to a certain extent, money has always been the mother's milk of politics. It wasn't as expensive because you didn't have television, right? But you still had to have party presses. In the 1828 election, I remember, the Whigs the National Republicans were going around trying to combat the Democrats by doing everything they could to set up an anti-Jackson press. And of course that anti-Jackson press was scurrilous, but it took money to do that. The bag man, was it Webster or Clay? One of them was the bag man for this, was collecting, the first finance director, right? And gathering money together in order to get these newspapers going. So this is not completely new, right? Politics depends on money. Where do you find the money? People who have the money. But right now it's awful. I think, certainly the Democratic Party, both sides of the Democratic Party are want to change that as best they can, beginning by getting into Citizens United, which requires a new Supreme Court. You get my drift. But there's something critically wrong with that. If only for the perception, quite apart from the reality. How can you have a decent democratic system and where this is going on? It's scandalous. Regardless of whether it's true or not, you don't want to do it. And we're in Washington, so congressmen spend all their time on the phone raising money. What a drag. You're supposed to be there. It's not what we elected them to do, but it's what they have to do. And I know more than one congressman who's finally just given it up because it just gets sick of it. So it hurts our government in all kinds of ways, quite apart from corruption. People have the idea that somehow it's simply a matter of, some big money guy goes out, writes a check, and you go, anything you want, sir. That's not what happens. But the corruption occurs in many other ways, including keeping you from doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is governing. So.
Could I just interject for 1 second? Oh, go ahead, ma'am. Go
Ma'am.
ahead.
Big money buying politicians rather than the other way around.
I wish that politicians could buy big money. That would be good. Or could control big money. Well, look, it's a problem. It's there, and it's there even if, but the perception in some ways is as bad as the reality. We have to find some way to conduct our politics better. Look, in the old days too, I'll make a plea for parties here. In the way old days, even though Henry Clay and Dan Webster were gathering the money to do all this stuff, parties were very strong. When was the last time that any of you actually went to a party function? Recently? No. When was the last time any of you ever wore a button with a candidate on it? All right, a few. A few, but not many. When I was growing up, everybody had a button. School kids had buttons because parties were strong. Parties were robust. That became the definition of politics. That has disappeared. That has ended. Although, you see some of it in an election like this, you would probably see a little bit more of it, but not a whole lot, right? So parties, I think parties themselves have become weaker in American life, in American politics. And that's, I think, very unfortunate. I believe that strong parties make for a strong democracy. And the stronger the parties are, the more involved people will be, but also the better the government will be run if you have strong parties. It seems counterintuitive, given all of our view that politicians are just skunks, and parties are skunks, and all they're going to do is yell at each other. But in fact, strong parties make for more participation, make for better politics, as far as I'm concerned. And in America, that usually means two parties, because three parties just don't last, given the way we're not a parliamentary system. That's the way it's going to be. Although 30 parties are fine from time to time to go and, the great historian once said the third parties are like bees. First they sting and then they die. But the sting can be very important. Ma'am.
Hi. Sir, you mentioned Woodrow Wilson,
Yes.
and you also mentioned foreign policy.
Yes.
I like to hear your comment about Woodrow Wilson's involvement with China in 1919. As you know, 1919 to the Chinese is called Chinese Renaissance.
Yes.
And many students, university students, protested and all that. And then, but what was Woodrow Wilson?
I suspect you know a whole lot more about this than I do, and I say that because with truthfully, Woodrow Wilson in China. I don't have. Well, by the time we got to 1919 and Woodrow Wilson, I'm not going to defend because I don't really know much about his Chinese policy.
I don't
so,
either. I
okay.
don't
Well, then
know
we're
about
even.
Woodrow
That's good.
Wilson's
Does anybody
involvement
know
in that.
much about Wilson in 1919 in China in the audience? No?
Well, it was the
Woodrow
end of
Wilson
the
in my
First
1919 was not in great shape, let me just say.
Yeah.
He was, the League of Nations was about to go and he had a stroke and he was not in great shape. So that I do know about what was going on with Woodrow Wilson in
You had the
1920.
Treaty of 1919.
Well, he had the Treaty of Versailles and
Treaty
then
of Versailles.
we didn't get it ratified.
Kept going home.
That's right, it didn't work out. And then he got sick.
That's the Treaty of Versailles that the university students were protesting.
Well, we didn't get it through, you see. We wanted to get it and it just didn't happen. His whole vision of a new world order.
But they did not protest against Woodrow Wilson.
Well,
I think they have a good impression of Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, there are avenues to Woodrow Wilson everywhere, so that's fine. Okay.
If there's nobody else, I'm going to take the last question. But
Please.
if there is somebody else, please come up to the mic. Actually, I have two questions. One is sort of the inverse of what we were just talking about of politicians being influenced or not or corrupted by big money. Isn't it interesting that there is this fallacious notion that seems to take hold that a rich politician cannot be bought?
Yeah.
Wendell Willkie, 1940, comes
Yeah.
to mind. But the more serious question is, there's a lot of talk right now about economic and political reform. And in 1936, in his incredible nomination speech in Philadelphia, FDR really connected the two and basically said, regardless of what the founders thought, you can't have one without the other. You can't reform one without the other. The two go hand in hand.
Right.
How is that playing out in your view this year?
Say that again. Listen, I mean,
that economic, Bernie's basically talking about you have to have economic reform, you have to have political reform.
Right.
You got to have a system that's not corrupt politically, and you can't have the kind of income inequality that we have. You can't really have one without. Can you have one without the other? I guess is the question.
well, I mean,
Trump sort of asserts that the same thing, but then he's off raising gazillions of dollars last night from massive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't
wealthy
know.
donors.
I don't know. I mean, FDR did a pretty good job without a great deal of political reform. And I don't think the political system was any less corrupt in many ways than it is now, in 1936. I think I don't know the answer to this question. I haven't really thought it through. But I do think there's a way in which one can fetishize either of those things. And one can turn, one can have the idea that that there is one thing that has to be done above all, whether it's political reform or economic reform, right? And you have to address all these things and everything else will follow, and that's not going to work. My point is less to do with political reform. That's fine, I'm all for it, it's great, but let's get the government to actually get things done. And that requires skills that are not about political reform or not. That is about the skills of how the system actually continues to work. And that's really what this book is about. I don't know that a political reform is going to change that. Certainly not going to change the Constitution of the United States. The gridlock that we're in now, that's often brought up. And to what I say, the gridlock that exists now, it's nothing structural. It's nothing inevitable. It's that one party is holding things up, and one party refuses to get involved. So what's going to happen is one party is going to win and the other party is going to lose. And that, maybe I'll end with this, which is not answering your question at all, but it's why this election is so important. I mean, every 4 years, politicians come and say this is the most important election of your life, right? And this year it happens to be true. The reason is only this: regardless of who gets the nomination, this was true a year ago. If the Republicans win the White House, they will have control of American government at every level, from states, state houses, governorships, all three branches of the federal government, which Scalia, but nevertheless, if the Republican gets in, you can be sure that the Supreme Court will be very conservative for a very long time. That's extraordinary, that one political party and a very conservative political party will have control of every level of American government. That's what happens if a Republican wins. And I don't care which Republican it was, if a Republican wins the White House, okay? If a Democrat wins the White House, regardless of who it is, chances are good that Democrats will win the Senate, take the Senate back. Then you have a very different Supreme Court. Then you have the first thing, looking like a liberal Supreme Court for 30, 40 years. The House, who knows what will happen, but maybe Citizens United will be undone. So we're at a crossroads, and we're going one way or the other. I mean, when Abraham Lincoln in 1858 talked about the House divided, he was talking about slavery. We're not talking about slavery, but we're talking about really the legacy of all the progressive reform we've had since the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement. That is on the line in this election. The fact that it's gotten so crazy only makes it more, important. And in fact, I think the two are related. The fact that it's so important is one reason why we're getting the craziness. But that is what this election is about. We're either going to go one way or the other. And it's in our hands. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, however you want that to end, you better be fighting for it, because it's going to be that way. Ma'am.
I think we're all going to go out and get a button tomorrow. One of the things that alerted me to what I finally see holistic in your book is my grandchildren were very involved in Occupy Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And I didn't understand it at first.
Right.
But it became very clear. But it was this protest, I think, that really made a big difference. It never left our minds. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that kind of protest is what moves parties, or what moves a party?
I think it can change the conversation and the national conversation in very big ways. Occupy Wall Street was a good example of that. It was the announcement that 2008 had happened and changed our politics. And that was the first, to my mind, that I can remember, the first, real shot across the bow to both parties, all of America. This is what's happening here. The 1%, the 99%, all of that got into the papers, and that conversation just hadn't been there before. That's not to say that there weren't people in politics who were not concerned about economic inequality. It's not as if the politicians are just kind of not thinking about much of anything, or ciphers. No, there are plenty of people who were, but by dramatizing the issue when they made it possible to talk about it and act about it in a different kind of way. And it is this, back and forth of the egalitarians, the Occupy kids, I say, they're not such kids, but I'm getting old. The activists. Believe me, the politicians listened to them. But it wasn't as if all of them were thinking, that's a new idea. Wow, there are rich people in America and there's income inequality. Gee, I hadn't thought of that. That's not what political, right? We all know that isn't the case. But it changes the political atmosphere. This is what Dr. King said. This is what Dr. King said the civil rights movement was doing, was it making it possible for people to do what they know they should do, but they can't do, or they haven't done, or they refuse to do. It's not that they don't understand it, it's that you have to change things. You have to change you have a crisis situation, you're going to make it, break it. That's what they do. And when it really works well, as you saw with Dr. King and President Johnson in 1964-65, it is a beautiful thing. It can be a beautiful thing. And I go back to the 1930s, and you can see that again. Now, I'm speaking as a Democrat, so there are people who might not think it's such a beautiful thing. But it certainly is an effective thing. It's the way that things have always gotten done. That's the theme here. And I hope you all go out and get buttons.
Thank you. Wait, we have one. If you could just quickly ask a very quick question. I also just want to say that if you have not gotten a copy of the book, we have plenty up front, and Sean will sign up here. Please fold your chairs at the end, but let's just we have about 2 minutes left. So real quick question and real quick answer. And sir, if you could ask your question of him maybe afterward, if that's fine. Thank you.
So I want to thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
But my question is, what do you think the role of the 24-hour networks and news channels are? And part of the reason why I asked that is because, we talk about all these important issues. We're referencing slavery. We're talking about the role of government overall. We're talking about the impact of money. And yet we're in a moment now where we have states suing the federal government over who can use the bathroom.
Right.
Okay? So I was wondering what you think the impact of the infotainment side, because what I see is people don't even agree on what the issues are.
People don't agree what the facts are.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that's it. Everyone has their own facts because
right.
you can, whatever validates your own. So, what do you think the role of that plays? Because the Edward R. Murrow is not around, unfortunately.
Yeah, you look at that crew up there and you see which one of those is the most like Edward R. Murrow, and you sometimes wonder. Not that I'm putting them down, but it's not their fault. It's the situation's changed.
Absolutely.
It's become entertainment. It's not about the news anymore.
Yeah.
Well, that's a huge question, which is everything. It's not just the 24. Well, Patty Chayefsky. Network. Patty Chayefsky was a prophet. Elia Kazan, movie called The Face in the Crowd, which you should see, from 1957. He was the prophet of all of this. It was there from the beginning. But now, with social media and all the rest of it, it's not only become siloed, it's not only become, have your own facts, it's become hysterical. It's the hystericalization of American politics, especially at the grassroots, that is very much a part of what's going on these days. So we've been talking about the mass media, the 24-hour 7. We know about that, but what's made it even more, what has amplified that, and made it, I think, even crazier, is what's going on in terms of social media. People under 30 don't watch TV. They certainly don't read the New York Times, right? But they're getting their information other places. That gets to a level of not just, constructing your own views. It is constructing your own reality. And when people are living in a reality, the different universe, then we have a democratic crisis of the worst kind, one we've never faced before. People have people lie, but not to this extent. So that's a sad answer to an important question. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.